Hello, and thank you for coming to my talk on managing sensory needs in gifted and neurodivergent people. My name is Dr. Matt Zakreski, and I am a clinical psychologist who specializes in working with gifted and other neurodivergent folks. We're going to go ahead and start this recording, and thank you for being here. There we go. So I can't listen to you because my t-shirt is too itchy, the sensory needs of gifted learners. So we're going to go over sensory processing and sensory processing disorder, give examples of how that impacts neurodivergent brains, go through some classroom and community adaptations to make this easier for you. Um, you will get these slides, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me at the end. So wherever you are listening to this, I want you to take a minute and just stop for a second, get really quiet as you can, and see what things emerge to you as you do. Now, as I do this, I went from hearing just the sound of my own voice and the general sounds of my home to now I can hear my neighbor down the street mowing his lawn, and there seems to be a helicopter somewhere nearby. And I do this exercise to start with because our brains and bodies are constantly taking in sensory information. If we paid attention to all the pieces of sensory information we got all the time, we would never do anything because it would just be too darn much. So our brains get really good at triaging the most important parts of our sensory experience. Right now, I hope it's primarily my voice that you're hearing since you willingly chose to come to this. But if you let your focus shift onto other parts of your experience, you'll realize how your shirt feels on your body, what kind of shoes you're wearing, the temperature of the room, the warmth or coldness of your coffee. All of these things are sensory experiences that give our bodies important pieces of data on how to navigate the world around us. So this is a really cool thing. It's like a superpower that you can tap into or tap out of to make yourself more aware of what's going on all around you. So there is a common conception that we have five senses: sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. And those are the five primary senses, but we have several other senses that are worth going through as well. The first is proprioception, or body location. I'm sitting at a table right now as I record this, so I don't really need to worry about my body in space. But when I give this talk in public, I'm constantly aware of where's the podium, where are the people sitting, where's my where's the screen behind me, where are the doors, right? Understanding your body is in space is really important because ask any ADHDer, how many times have you walked into the side of a door frame or a wall recently and they'll stare at you like, wait, what? You do that too? Because neurodivergent people tend to have poor proprioception. Next one we have is vestibular sense, the body's ability to do smooth movement. Smooth movement is helpful in things like handwriting, in like catching a ball or throwing a ball. Um, Smooth movements like riding a bicycle, these things are an important part of our sensory experience. The smoother our body gets with something, the less energy it's spending on doing that activity, which means our brain can shove more bandwidth off to other things. Next thing we have is thermoception, or temperature sense. Now, a lot of neurodivergent people are either hypersensitive to temperature sensations or hyposensitive. They don't get enough. I am definitely in the latter category. I have a very good internal thermostat, and my body's always like, oh, this is the temperature I'm at right now. All right, then. But you might be someone who's very sensitive to temperature and need to wear a lot of layers. You might always have a hoodie or a blanket with you. So that is a sensory thing as well. We have equilibrioception, or our sense of balance. How regulated are based on our inner ear function. And we have nociception, which is pain. Once again, a lot of neurodivergent people can be hyper or hyposensitive to pain, whereas things that might hurt other people might not hurt us, and things that might not hurt other people might hurt us a lot. So sensory processing is the neurological process that organizes sensation from one's own body and the environment and makes it possible to use that body effectively within said environment. So we're taking in information both from internally and externally and using it. Like we said before, our body is constantly taking in that sensory information. It's around us all the time. Our body just gets very good at triaging what matters. Sensory processing becomes a disorder where that multisensory integration is not adequately processed in order to provide appropriate responses to the environment. So if you're in gym class and the lights are too bright and you can't pay attention to the gym teacher because the lights are so bright and the room is so squeaky, and you don't pick a team for volleyball, well, you're going to get in trouble. And that's where that sensory processing has become disordered in that moment. Um, Sensory processing disorder is noted as a condition to monitor in the DSM-5. We are hopeful that it will become a condition that we can process and treat in the next version of it, and as in the ICD-11. So it is a thing we know exists. It is a thing that the psychological community has been a little bit resistant to making a formal diagnostic stance on because it is very hard to understand sensory things like we're going to go through the back half of this presentation, but it's important to know that it's moving in that direction. So where do the problems happen? So sensory issues can come from over processing sensory information. The buzzing of the lights is too loud. The buzzing of the lights is too loud. I can't hear you over the buzzing of the lights. Whereas most people aren't even aware of that sound, but our brains are over processing. It's too much information. Or under processing sensory information. You meet somebody at a mixer or an event, they're like, oh, hey, my name is Steve. And you're like, yeah, it's nice to meet you, Mark, Allen, Eduardo, Frank, Batman. So we're under processing that information, or the sensory input is lost in transit. We're not registering the information as it comes across our brains and bodies. When our sensory process is interrupted or dysregulated, we can have problems of sensory overload. So what we have here is we have areas where we're understimulated, and then we have the zone of ideal stimulation where we're having the right amounts of sensory input. The pizza is the right temperature. The pool is the right temperature. The background noise is an appropriate level for what I'm trying to do. When we go out of that zone, we get into sensory stress, right? That's when it's like, ah, God, I can't wait to unbutton my tie. My shirt is too tight, or it's like a little bit too cold. I wish I had a jacket. It's stressful. Our bodies are reacting to it, but it hasn't quite reached that level of problem yet. And when it does reach that level, we get sensory overload and leads us to sensory crisis. Our bodies become much less efficient when we're in sensory crisis because our body becomes so aware of trying to deal with that sensory input, we become much less functional in other things. So we want to use sensory informed care to get out in front of this and keep people in that ideal stimulation area so we don't have to do big interventions when they are essentially overwhelmed, because big interventions in those areas tend to be loud, chaotic things that give a lot of more sensory input. So if you have someone who's already sensory overwhelmed and you're yelling at them to calm down, you're adding more sensory stuff to the situation. So we don't want to restrain somebody. We don't want to kick somebody out of the classroom. We want to help them modulate their sensory experiences so they can stay in that ideal zone. So this is one of my favorite stories to tell. So a couple years ago, I was asked to consult on a case here in New Jersey. We had a 13-year-old girl, and she's a gifted student. She is sort of your archetypal gifted kid. She was pleasant and polite, great student, good member of the community. Everybody loved her, right? And for the purposes of this story, I'll call her Sally. And Sally was just, everybody loved her. And then all of a sudden, one day, Sally turned into hell on wheels. All of a sudden, Sally was really difficult. And her parents were concerned, the teachers were concerned, our Girl Scout leader was concerned. What the heck is going on here? So they called me in to do a consult because they know I'm an expert in this. And I chatted with them and tried to get to the bottom of it. I had a couple interviews with Sally. We did our standard mental health evaluations, nothing out of the ordinary. I was like, what are we missing? What is the thing here that we don't know? And we're processing and we're looking around and we're trying to figure it out. And Sally keeps saying, nothing's happened. Nobody's abused me. Nobody's hurt me. There's no major changes at home. My friends are still being nice to me. I'm just trying to figure out what's going on too, because I just can't stop being in a bad mood. So after a while, you know, I was sitting with her in her room and said, all right, Sally, we've covered every question, we've asked everything. I don't know what's going on, and I'd really like to help you get to the bottom of this. Is there anything else that's changed? Any question I haven't asked you? And she's like, honestly, Dr. Matt, nothing is different in my life now except for this stupid bra that I'm wearing. And I was like, I'm sorry, what now? She goes, well, this bra, this sucks. I'm like, Sally, how long have you been wearing a bra? She's like, well, I was wearing a training bra until like a couple of weeks ago, and now I have like one of these real bras, and I hate it. It's really uncomfortable. Now, we know that over 60% of women wear bras that don't fit them properly. And we know that the kind of bras we tend to give young girls tend to have that underwire support in them. So I called the female staff and we had a conversation with Sally about her bra. And we found out very quickly that this bra was way too tight and the underwire was cutting into her rib cage. And so it was putting a lot of pressure on her chest and her ribs. But she didn't have the words to tell us what the heck was going on. So it was just sitting there in intense sensory discomfort all day, and to the point where she was just lashing out at people. So we called her mom. We told her this situation. Mom took her out. She bought her a bralette. And I'm telling you, it's very rare in psychology that these things happen, but Sally went back to normal pretty much immediately. I was like those old episodes of House when he would come up with some like random cure for this obscure disease and he'd give them a shot and like, oh, I can walk again, right? It was really like that. She just went back to being Sally. And it was this incredible experience for us. It's like, damn, that is the power of sensory input. So, where does all this stuff come from? So, the parietal lobe is on top of our head, and this integrates sensory information across our brains and bodies. The parietal lobe gives us spatial sense and navigation. There's that proprioception, where our bodies are in space. It also has the homunculus, or from the Latin little man, and that different parts of the brain are coded to different parts of the body that are giving certain amounts of sensory input. And we're going to go through that more in just a moment. The parietal lobe also gives us mechanoreception, so the sensory inputs from our skin. We talked about temperature and pain, also our body's physical location in space, right? These are things that our skin is giving that. And remember, the skin is the biggest sensory organ in our body. Interestingly, the parietal lobe also gives us language processing. The Wernicke area is in the parietal lobe. So here's our homunculus, right? Here is how the parietal lobe codes to different parts of your body. Now, like all parts of the brain, it is bilateral, right? So it is the left side of your parietal lobe does the right side of your body. The right side of your body, I'm sorry, the left side of your body goes to the right side of your parietal lobe. And you can see here, all the different parts of your body have a certain amount of sensory space given to them in the brain. So things that are very sensitive, like your tongue and your fingertips, have a lot more space to them, whereas things like your shoulders and your eyebrows have less. You also notice that yes, the genitals are on there too. That's an area with a lot of sensory input, right? We're allowed to talk about that. We're grown-ups, right? So this gives us a lot of data. And you notice how the somatosensory cortex connects to the motor cortex because a lot of the sensory input we get in our brains connects directly to physical movement, right? Pulling your hand away from a hot stove or taking off an uncomfortable shirt or running away or escaping an unpleasant sensory information. So our bodies are wired to keep us safe. Sometimes the sensory input we get connects directly to a physical motor function to get us out of there. So broadly speaking, sensory processing disorder comes in three categories. We have sensory modulation disorder, where we are under responsive, over responsive, or craving sensory input. sensory discrimination disorder, where we can't tell sensory inputs apart, right? It's like, are you hugging me or are you trying to crush me to death? I can't tell. Or sensory-based motor disorder, which is largely just, in the dyspraxia family, which is really, a poor sense of fine motor control and where our bodies are in space. So there's a lot of subtypes within the broader construct of sensory processing disorder. And one or all of these may define you or your kid, but it's the more we know about the nuances of it, the more we're able to connect that to, oh, hey, here's where we're going to intervene based on the data that we're getting here. So we're going to talk about the power of sensory input for a moment. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to hold up an imaginary bowl. You see here me holding up my imaginary bowl, and my imaginary bowl is ceramic. It's a ceramic bowl. Now here I have in my other hand an imaginary fork. Look at my imaginary fork. What a neat fork this is. I'm going to take my imaginary fork and put it in the ceramic bowl, and I'm going to go like this. And I guarantee you somebody out there watching this video is going, no, because we are so finely tuned to our sensory experiences that the idea of hearing that awful metal fork on a ceramic bowl thing is enough to make us go like that. But it's not actually happening, right? Not only are you and I not in the same physical space, but I don't have a bowl and nor do I have a fork right now. I did this exercise once in a ballroom in Portland, Oregon, and a woman literally fell out of her chair. She's like, "Oh, don't do it, please stop." I'm like, "Ma'am, I'm not actually doing anything." Right? But that's how powerful our brains are. But our sensory experiences don't all have to be negative. They don't all have to be unpleasant. We can flip the script and seek out positive sensory experiences. So think about wherever you're from in the world, think about the best pizza place near you, right? So for us, it's a place called Anthony Franco's here in northern New Jersey. Now we love Anthony Franco's pizza. Imagine yourself walking into that pizza parlor, right? You open the doors. What is it you smell? Is it dough? Is it sauce? Is it spices? Is it the grill? What are you smelling? What's that good smell? And then you've ordered a pizza and they hand you the pizza across the counter. As I tell you this story, as you picture this in your own brain, what's happening to your body? And I know for me, my mouth is watering right now, right? And I have no pizza in front of me, though I think I know what I'm going to make my kids for dinner tonight. But our brains connect that positive experience to a physiological response, right? Thinking about a delicious pizza place makes our bodies hungry. Our bodies are reacting as though we are about to eat that delicious pizza. And I've made all of us really hungry right now, and I'm sorry for that. But I also want to say that the power of the sensory experience isn't only negative, it can be positive as well. So, who has sensory needs? So, as we've discussed, sensory challenges occur when the brain is not able to properly respond to the external and internal stimulation of the world. Now, the brain is able and designed to respond to a certain amount of sensory stimuli, but the more sensitive you are, the harder it is to keep that in the ideal range. These challenges are much more common with neurodivergent individuals. We see that a lot more ADHD, autism, giftedness in particular. But we also see it with oppositional defiant disorder, OCD, even dyslexic kids can have challenges, Tourette's as well. So neurodivergent brains have a increased sensitivity to sensory experiences, and thus it's hard to keep them in that ideal range. And broadly speaking, you can cut the sensory experiences in two. You can be sensory seeking or sensory sensitive. So sensory seeking kids are kids who want to make loud noises. They want to touch it. They want to jump up and down. They want to run. They're the kids who will sing or loudly gargle to themselves because the sound of their own voice is very appealing to them. It gives them sensory input. Flipping the lights on and off. I think a lot of parents are nodding at me right now. Taking risks. They may not want to, they want to be tickled. They want to be massaged. They want to be held, right? They may not notice if they've got their shoes on the wrong feet or their shirt on backwards. Whereas your sensory sensitive kid, right, probably doesn't want to have their hair brushed, going to be a picky eater because they don't like certain textures of foods. Loud noises, bright lights, big smells are going to be really hard for them. These are the kids that if their socks are on crooked, they will not put their shoes on because their socks are wrong, they're twisted. Um, and it's funny, you can largely say like there's really, even though this is sort of falls short in some ways, it's funny to say there are really two kinds of neurodivergent people. There are the you got to wear shoes all the time neurodivergent people, and the I never wear shoes neurodivergent people. I'm a wear shoes person. I wear shoes all the time. My wife and my kids are all barefoot people. I'm like, oh, but I need the sensory input of my shoes. And they're like, oh God, how could you want that? So, you know, it's a way to think about your kids, right? Is your kid sensory over responsive, which is going to be that sensory sensitive person, or sensory under responsive, which is going to be that sensory seeking. They're trying to balance out that body. Now, all of the motor behaviors that come from regulating our sensory experiences start here in the prefrontal cortex, right? Front part of our brain. Now, this gives us a lot of parts of what make us us. Planning, follow through, task initiation, task completion, self-regulation. All of these things are part of the prefrontal cortex. The problem is that the prefrontal cortex has to balance all of these different things, right? So all of these parts of the brain are competing for our attention, and the dopamine that allows us to make the behaviors associated with these sensory stimulations. So things are competing for our attention. We have thoughts and memories. We're going to have sensory input from our bodies, and we're going to anticipate wanting certain sensory rewards or avoiding certain sensory things. We've also got emotions. We've also got our perceptions of those emotions. So our brain is fighting. All of it wants attention. All of it feels like it's really important. And our brains are really bad at triaging what's most important and what's not. So what ends up happening is you get into a car accident, you get into a bottleneck where all this information is jamming through this one part of the brain at once. And when there's a backup, that's where we get stressed out. That's when we get overwhelmed. That's where we make mistakes, right? And the more stressed out the cars in the traffic jam get, the more likely we are to have more accidents and more problems, right? So sometimes all we can do is just have every car stop and just have one car at a time go. And if you have the discipline to step into that, that car traffic jam might take a while to untangle, but it will untangle. It's also worth noting that neurodivergent kids are likely to develop asynchronously or out of sync with each other. So a neurotypical kid is likely going to be 10 years old in everything they do. 10 years old academically, motor skills, social skills, special talent skills, emotional skills. They're basically 10 in everything they do. In a in a in a neurodivergent kid, they tend to develop asynchronously. What that means is that your kid, since there's only so much developmental energy to go around, some parts of the brain get more than they'd expect, some parts get less than they'd expect. So we tend to see kids with hypersensory sensitivities, increased intelligence, bigger personalities, and that comes at the cost of decreased emotional skills, decreased fine motor skills, and sometimes decreased social skills. And the more neurodivergent you are, right? If you are quote unquote just gifted, you're going to have some asynchrony. If you are twice exceptional, you're going to have more asynchrony. And we know since one neurodivergence predicts other neurodivergences, a kid who's gifted is much more likely to be dyslexic and ADHD and autistic and dyspraxic and all these other things. The more we go down that diagnostic trail, the more we're going to see asynchrony coming across in different spaces. It's also worth talking about the motor skills in kids. So psychomotor skills often develop differently in neurodivergent kids. And that's going to show up in handwriting, catching a ball, tying your shoes. If you're at a prep school, tying the tie or putting on the skirt or the penny loafers, right? And this is particularly challenging because when we think about the skills that are valued by one's peers when you're growing up, it's things like art and music and facility at sports, things that your developmental trajectory is going to push you away from, right? I have a kid who I worked with. He's taking graduate level math courses at a major university, and he's 8 years old. and his parents sent him to me because he can't tie his shoes. Right. And you wouldn't think, well, why would you send someone to therapy because you can't tie your shoes? Well, he's having big emotional meltdowns every morning over the fact that he can't tie his shoes. But it's a fine motor delay, right? He just can't tie those things together because his brain is so overdeveloped in some areas, it had to log in some other ones. So we're going to see kids with, awkward running, poor posture, weak core body strength. These are kids who may not be able to do a pull-up, who might have trouble carrying groceries, who may have trouble sitting upright because those core muscles aren't as strong, and difficulty with those fine motor skills like handwriting and tying your shoes. We know that neurodivergent people tend to be more intense, and a lot of that intensity comes from the limbic system, the emotional regulation centers of our brain. And you obviously are going to get these slides and you can see this picture. The most important thing is that we said, that sensory experience, some of it is pain. Pain brings emotion. Emotion plus pain equals behaviors, right? So the bigger the response in the limbic system, the bigger behavior we're going to see on the outside. So it's a difference between like, ooh, that was a little hotter than I wanted to, and oh my God, that's so sharp. I'm screaming and running. I think I'm in so much pain, right? Our limbic system is giving us that fear response or giving us that anger response. And if you're like me and you tend to get sensorily overloaded, you might actually experience that sensory overload as anger, right? Because this is the power of the limbic system. It's the amygdala, our source of fight or flight emotions, is saying, there's a lot of stimulation going on right now. This is making me feel angry. This is making me feel like irritated or rageful. And it's a way to deal with that input very quickly, but not always effectively. So I love this cartoon. Congratulations, you won sensory processing disorder. The bonus prize is anxiety. Because the other thing that limbic system is doing, it is constantly monitoring our environment for threats, right? So we've got a sensory system that's turned up to 1,000 and an emotional system that is dialed up as well. So hypersensitivity plus um, anxious monitoring the environment. Of course, a person with sensory needs is going to be more anxious because there are more things in the environment that are going to be not neutral in nature, right? More things in the environment that will cause intense pleasure or intense displeasure. And since our bodies are wired to avoid displeasure, they're going to monitor the environment for that's the bad kind of chicken nuggets, or there's too much pollen in the air, or I can't go to that room because the lights are too bright, or it's too echoey, or the sound or the hallway's too squeaky, because our bodies know that when we experience those feelings, the emotional cost is very high. So now that we've explained what it is, let's talk about what to do with it. So here are the signs of sensory overload: flushed face, extensive sweating, fidgety or restless behavior, sudden intense anger, feeling like a wave of exhaustion just hit you, a need to escape. It's a big one. Feeling touched out or like your skin is very sensitive. It feels like hot or sharp. Wanting to block out sensory input. This is the classic kid with the hands over the ears, eyes closed, rocking back and forth, seeing that stimming behavior increase. That's body desperately trying to self-regulate through a very dysregulating situation. So if you see these things in your kids, remember, communication is behavior. So if your kid is doing these things, it's telling you, hey, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, teacher, coach, I am in sensory overload and I'm about to do a behavior I'm not happy with. We're going to deal with this through sensory therapy. We're going to start with the just right challenge. We're going to successfully meet the challenge needed to get through these playful activities. We can only meet kids where they are, right? So if your kid has super high sensory needs to touch, we're going to start with the basic things they need to be able to survive touch: high fives, fist bumps, nods, whatever that things, as they move them up in that ladder. We're going to adapt behavior to be adaptive or pro-social in response. There are times in life where you can only run away from a sensory overload, but it's much more pro-social to say, hey, can you turn the music down? So we want to move towards adaptive responses. We want to actively engage kids, right? Sensory stuff can be so overwhelming when it's unpleasant. We want to remind kids that sensory stuff can be fun and enjoyable and move them in that way, in a way that's engaging and fun. and child directed. We're going to use the kid's preferences to initiate and maintain the therapeutic experience. If your kid is super motivated by gummy worms, you better believe I'm going to have gummy worms in every session to motivate that kid's behavior. Also, we want to create a sensory diet. It's a way to adjust sensory input in relation to that person's need. And just like a healthy diet is many foods, a sensory diet is a balanced sense of sensory information that allows that person to function. Any person can and will benefit from a sensory diet, right? This isn't just a neurodivergent thing, though, like many things, it impacts neurodivergent people more. The sensory diet is specific about the timing, frequency, and intensity and duration of that sensory input, right? So if I want you to tolerate bright lights more, I'm going to give you either a very intense light for a short period of time or an unpleasant light for a longer period of time just to calibrate your body so we can handle it more. But we do this intentionally with a lot of rewards. So here's your sensory diet timetable. You might say, on Monday morning, I'm going to try and brush my teeth for 30 seconds, even though that's very unpleasant for me. But my reward for that is I'm going to have the good kind of muffin for breakfast, right? And then Wednesday afternoon, I have to do my math homework, which involves handwriting, which I don't want to do. So I'm going to get myself a bowl of Skittles. After every math problem, I get a Skittle, right? We're balancing unpleasant and pleasant sensory experiences to regulate our bodies through these things. What a lot of times our kids do is they just try and push through, they white knuckle it to all these very unpleasant sensory experiences and end up feeling worse on the back end. So if your kids are at school, we want to think about how to support them there. Flexible seating, especially walking around the classroom. I mean, goodness me, it's 2024. Well, as I record this, it's 2024. The idea of like, what if they cheat? I think that ship has sailed, right? If kids can walk around the classroom and they're not bothering anybody, that's okay. Thinking about how to navigate classrooms and hallways. Does your kid need to leave a minute early or leave a minute late so the big crush of people in the hallway is gone? That's something you can write into an IEP or a 504 plan. Fidget toys, chair bands, having Velcro on the table, all of those things give sensory stimulation and help keep kids regulated in class. Having a board bag or a board box, a box of preferred options that a kid can use during downtime or when they need to sensory regulate. If your kid comes from gym class where they're wildly overstimulated into English class where they have to sit and read, they might need a board box of Rubik's Cube to fiddle with while they're reading Tom Sawyer. A preferred sensory space, give me my sensory rooms, right? They need to be set up ahead of time because if the sensory room has been used for something, it'll guarantee that's the day your kid will need it. So what's the sensory room? What's the backup sensory room? Adaptive schedule and plans for sensory challenge classes. The more unstructured classes tend to be bigger sensory challenges: gym, art, music, lunch, school assemblies, God help me, right? Fire drills. I say this to administrators all over the country. It actually only helps us to tell your kids with sensory needs when a fire drill is coming, right? In fact, I think it's not a bad thing to tell the whole school because then we know and it helps us to know the difference between an actual threat and a drill, right? That way, if your kids know that that awful fire drill sound is happening and we didn't know what's happening, this might actually be an emergency, right? But your kids with sensory needs, the blinding flashing lights, the piercing noise. I mean, I have had kids fall to the ground and weep and wail, which then makes it harder to get them out of the classroom and out of the building to safety. We want them to know what's coming so we know how to help them in those situations. And we're seeing the wave start to turn on this. Less smartphone use in school, and I am in full support of that because smartphones have become this sensory recalibration thing. But what it does is it's not actually acclimating us to the sensory needs. It's blowing them away because now we can play Candy Crush or go on Twitter. And then we can ignore those sensory things. We're not using it to regulate ourselves through it. We're using to blast that experience out of the water. So smartphones can be a tool, right? If you want to use the Calm app or Headspace, something like June, the gamifying your chores and executive functioning, all those things are productive skill building things. So if you're going to use your phone, let's use it for that. But otherwise, I would rather you use real life coping strategies. So here's what some of these things look like. You know, noise canceling headphones in the classroom, having the Velcro under the desk so kids can touch it and play with it. There's well, this one they call a break box, but a board box is very similar. Chair bands, this one is $7 on the internet. You can buy it for $7. Sensory bottles, and these things are all inexpensive, and they're all things that any kid can use in any classroom from pre-kindergarten to graduate school. Sensory needs at home, foods, thinking about preferred foods versus non-preferred foods, when to challenge and when to accommodate. And in all honesty, I've talked to dietitians about this and developmental pediatricians. Fed is best. If your kid is refusing to eat the turkey dinner you made, but they're willing to eat a bowl of cereal, it is better to eat a bowl of cereal than nothing at all. And what I tell parents is like, then have the kid make it. I don't want you to work like you're a shorter cook in a diner, right? If your kid doesn't want to eat the enchiladas and they can make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, fine, they can do that, right? Fed is best. When you have meals coming up like a wedding or a holiday where there's going to be unusual or unpredictable food, let's talk about it beforehand. At Thanksgiving, you may not want to eat the turkey, but can you eat the mashed potatoes or the green beans or the cornbread? Let's find a thing you can eat so you can engage in the meal. And then if there are other things, it costs you nothing to make a box of mac and cheese along with the turkey dinner. Remember, these behaviors, they're not about us. It's about our kids trying to navigate the world. Always have a list of and access to the preferred sensory experiences and items. If your kid is really motivated by gummy worms or spicy sweet chili Doritos, how many of those do we have in the homes? Can we use that to motivate behavior? Noise canceling headphones, having that go bag, which is the community version of a board bag, lighting, temperature, background noise, right? Can we adjust those things? Can we put scalar items of that in the kids' room so they can turn down the lights, or have like one of those light bulbs that changes colors? Sometimes blue light works better than the overall light. Setting expectations for visitors, right? My kid is going to be in the swing, or my kid may need to wrap up in a blanket. That's just how they regulate. It's actually them trying to stay in the room with us. Laundry day, if your kid only wears certain kinds of clothes, we want to get out in front of laundry as best we can. It may feel really inefficient, but sometimes you just got to wash 3 shirts and 2 pairs of pants because that's what your kid needs to get through the rest of the week. That's okay. And it's totally appropriate to give your kids more ownership of the laundry they're doing. You don't have to be beholden to it. And then cleaning. Cleaning can be disruptive to routine. The smells and the textures can change. How are we scheduling cleaning? And once again, if your kid has sensory needs around things that are like, say, sticky or smelling, can we empower the kid to be a part of that solution, not just complain about it? So here are things that anybody can put in their home: a jumping ball, a pod swing, bean bags, the IKEA egg chair. All of these things provide meaningful sensory input that anybody can put in their home. Like some people put in like American Ninja Warrior style things outside, or a rock wall in the basement. And if you want to do those things, go with it. I mean, absolutely. If that's what your kid needs, do it. But these things are much cheaper and easier. Sensory needs of the community. Sensory needs won't end when you go outside. So we need to set expectations. Before you leave, have that 5-minute check-in. Here's where we're going. Here's what we're doing. Here's what I need from you. Here's what we have to be successful. Bring that board bag with you. Bathrooms are a sense of major sensory input, so let's be thoughtful about that. When in doubt, use the family restroom. It's going to be smaller, less overwhelming. Just because it works for other kids doesn't mean it's going to work for your kid. We want to think about other options, but we may not be able to use them. It's always better to leave 5 minutes early than 5 minutes too late. Remember that one. Smaller and shorter events can be better. If your kid gets really overwhelmed, it may be better to go to the birthday party for an hour, not 3 hours, just to make sure that we don't get overwhelmed. Because then when that meltdown happens, it's going to come quick. And reward yourself when the trip is over. So here are some of the signs of that sensory overload in the community and what you can do: movement breaks, schedule that alone time, have a safe space. But the idea of the rewards here is really important, because that dopamine circuit that we talked about before, cognitive controls like managing sensory experience take a lot of energy, right? And it costs us dopamine, We need to refill those dopamine tanks to be able to keep doing things. The problem is, though, if you're in the community, you're getting sensory hits from all these places, you are rapidly losing dopamine. And your kid may survive target, but may melt down at home when they can't get their shoes off. We want to refill those dopamine tanks. It is always okay to give your kid a reward. Ask my wife, I don't love furniture shopping. It's not my favorite thing. It's not so much a sensory thing for me. I just don't find it very exciting. But when we're done, we usually stop at Wendy's and I get a Frosty. And that means like, oh, I might not like this thing, but I get a Frosty afterwards. And that's okay. Your kid doesn't have to want to like it. Your kid doesn't want to have to do it. But if we reward it, it becomes more palatable in the future. It's important to remember that this can happen to adults too, teachers and parents. I know that since I've had children, my sensory level is much lower than it used to be. I get very overwhelmed by a lot of noise and I'll feel that anger, right? Like, oh, there's all this noise and I'm just trying to talk to somebody or I'm just trying to send a text message, and it's really painful. And we need to remember that we can invest in our own sensory needs just like we would invest in our kids' sensory needs. Maybe it's a bath bomb. Maybe it's a really nice cup of tea. Maybe it's just going outside and going on a walk for a little while, right? But this most important bubble that nobody gets it, share this slide deck with your kids' teachers, with your partner, with your boss. Sensory needs are real. And the more we get in front of them, the more we can manage it. The biggest thing here is that a lot of people don't understand sensory needs. It's probably been the biggest growth curve for me in my career as a psychologist working with this population. And I used to be less enlightened on this, but now I understand that it's okay to not be okay with this. It's okay to hate the dress you're wearing and having trouble focusing. It's okay to only want to eat a certain kind of chicken nuggets because you're just trying to manage the world, and the world is an overwhelming place. The trick is that once we understand our sensory needs, we can use that to inform not only where we are and how we support ourselves right now, but where we're going, right? Because neurodivergence is always context, but it's never an excuse. So if we're going to grow and change into the people we want to be, we need to think about how to make our sensory needs work for us, not against us. So here's how you track me down. I'm Dr. Matt at the Neurodiversity Collective. I've included some more resources here, some great articles and some really good books. Everything Sensory Processing Disorder is probably my personal favorite, but they're all really good. Thank you so much for your time. I can't wait till we that we meet in person. But until then, have a wonderful day and take care.